Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my June wrap-up. Now, you might hear the dog scratching the bed. There's nothing I can do about that. I've asked her to calm down, but she isn't prepared to do that until she is entirely comfortable. Anyway, if you happened to watch my June TBR, then you will know that I went into this month with great ambitions with regards to the number of books that I could read in 1 month. I think that I had about 15 to 20 books on there, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot in terms of the amount of books that I read this year. However, other things happened this month. I had a bit more overtime than I had originally anticipated for, and things were going on with the writers group. I was also working on Our Doris because Dane got the edits of the final few chapters in, and so I hadn't made space for that. Therefore, there are fewer books read in June than I had hoped for, and I say hoped because I'd hoped to get through more of the BookTube Prize books as well. The first book that I read in June is Elena Knows by Claudia Piñeiro, translated by Francis Riddle. Now, this follows the character of Elena, who is dealing with Parkinson's, I believe, that is causing her body to behave more like a prison. She feels very much trapped inside. If she doesn't take pills at a certain time of day, then her body will seize up and she isn't able to navigate the city as well as she used to be able to. Throughout this novel, she is investigating the death of her daughter because she disagrees with the police and coroner's report, and thus she has chosen to travel across the city. Her day is measured once again by the pills that she takes, and this adds a sense of urgency, really, because the reader knows that unless Elena is able to fulfill her wants in a certain amount of time, then she is going to have even further difficulties. Therefore, it adds this narrative tension as well as making the reader empathise and sympathise with the character's plight. As somebody who has dealt with the body not doing as I have wanted it to for a lot of my life, I was able to empathise with what Elena is going on with. However, Elena's condition is much worse than anything that I have ever dealt with. And I think that blending that with the grief of a mother, as well as discussing everything that is going on within a country, the mother-daughter divide, the way that children can feel under obligation to their parents, the way that parents may not do what is best for their children entirely accidentally. Elena behaves in a way that she believes has been best for her daughter. Sorry, I've got hairspray in my eye. If you happen to notice a red eye during this video, then do know that I accidentally sprayed hairspray into my eye about 5 minutes ago. In this novel, we have flashbacks, and through these flashbacks, we learn that Elena has behaved as a mother in the way that she believes has been best for her child. But there is this sense of dramatic irony because the reader brings in their own predisposed ideas as to what it means to be a parent and can recognise that maybe Elena has been a bit too harsh to her daughter, and maybe the mystery of what has happened to her isn't too difficult to recognise, but maybe a mother's grief is compounding this. I appreciated this novel because, as I have said before, I do like to read other authors' takes on grief. And I think that Elena here begins to recognise all of these things, and it does go through almost a cycle of the grief. And this isn't necessarily about Elena figuring out just what happened to her daughter. I'd say that this novel is also very much about Elena coming to accept what has happened to her daughter, and that maybe no matter what went on in the past, she is unable to change that, but also having to recognise that her daughter might have been the only person within the world who could have helped her going through what she is going through. I also like the way that Elena's newfound disabilities were handled, and how the discussion of this deterioration came up, and the way that we do discuss the familial obligations when it comes to caring for a person, and how for some family members this can feel like a call to arms, and for others it can feel like a burden upon their back. And I like the way that the author characterized Elena's illness, so as Elena was able to have these conversations with this illness and almost discuss it in this parasitic way, because it is causing huge detriment to her life, and it's just talked about in such a human fashion. This is not a novel where you read about an ill woman and it's to make able-bodied people feel good by the end of it. It's not one of those novels where it becomes uplifting in the end. And I was glad to see that in fiction. And as I say, appreciate the discussions about death, about grief, and about this illness. And I also liked what Elena had to say about religion within its pages. I should say Piñeiro. What Piñeiro had to say about religion and all of these things, using the voice of Elena, using the character of Elena. I understand what people were talking about when they were talking about their like for this book, because I ended up particularly liking it. Then I read Love in the Big City by Sang Young Park, translated by Anton. Firstly, the entire time reading this, I was reminded of the Lissy song Love in the City. Baby love, don't live in the city. Which I will leave a link to in the description. And secondly, I don't really remember much about this book, which probably isn't the best thing when it comes to literature. So I know that we followed a young man in Korea, and I believe that his name was Young. I know that he had a bit of a toxic relationship with his friend in the beginning, and they used to criticize each other about their boyfriends. I know that it's queer literature. I know that we have a young gay man navigating Korea, Seoul specifically, and the relationships and the activities that he gets up with other men, and the way that it explores these ideals of gay culture. I remember it being a rather fast read when I had the want to pick the book up. I know that it talked about bodily difference and the shame that people hold for certain body types and the way that certain bodies are perceived in the queer community. And I remember it being rather descriptive and feeling almost dreamlike to me in its structure, because it felt very hazy throughout the reading experience of this book for me. I don't think that the blurb tells you anything about the book. I don't know whether that's to its detriment or not. I remember it also talking about the character's relationship with his mother, the possibility of her being neglectful towards him. It's just difficult for me to recall anything about this book, really. I'm clutching at straws here, trying to come up with something to say to create some sort of review about this book, but all I can say is forgettable. Next, I read Companion Piece by Ali Smith and recorded a very ranty review about this, because I was not a fan of this. Having read the seasonal quartet, I had expected good things from Companion Piece. However, it felt like there was no nuance here, that Ali Smith just kept bashing you over the head with every single metaphor and anecdote that she wanted to share. At one point within the novel, she decides to just give up on one story entirely, to go back in time about 700 years and tell the story of this character that previously you'd wondered whether it was a metaphor or not. I don't mind the possible merging of times or the crossing of timelines. I don't mind this little bit of possible magical realism, but I do feel like Smith here, in some ways, didn't give the reader any opportunity to explore certain bits of wordplay that she was having or certain references that she was making, because she chose to just list everything that she wanted you to get from a certain reference. And at other times, I feel like she didn't explore certain aspects of the book well enough, and it was just a complete failure for me. There are some elements of wordplay and humour within here that might redeem the book, but overall, a complete nosedive and failure from the beginning. Disappointed. Then I read Fabulosa by Paul Baker, which is the story of Polari. This is a piece of non-fiction that I absolutely adored, and I read as though it was a thriller. I started reading it, I had to go out and do other things, and I did not appreciate that because I just wanted to sit there and read this entire book. I'd shove on a calm playlist, some smooth jazz, and read this one that explores the history of Polari, but also discusses the gay community and its history over the late 19th century and the entirety of the 20th century. How Polari was a secret language that helped the gay community communicate with one another without the fear of being arrested or accosted. It discussed the places that gay men could go and find supposed safe spaces where people didn't mind their sexuality so much, how they had to keep it secret, how they had to have these certain places to go because of the ways in which the law was written to suppress them and subjugate them. There's a lot in here about the radio show Round the Horn with Julian and Sandy, played by, one was Kenneth Williams, and I apologise for not recalling the other person's name. When I mentioned that I was reading this book, I managed to have conversations with people at work that I never anticipated having conversations with about these topics, because they knew of Polari through Kenneth Williams and hearing that on the radio when they were younger. And I do believe that that changed their perception or gave them new perspective about the gay community. And being able to have these conversations, I suppose, enhanced my reading experience of this book. But I also feel like Paul Baker has written a piece of non-fiction in this thoroughly entertaining fashion, which also explores the darker aspects of what faced the gay community over the last 100 or so years, 122 years, maybe even 140, specifically focusing on the criminalisation of homosexual acts and behaviours, and the way that this secret language that is somewhat maligned by certain gay people within the 90s and the early 2000s who believed that freedom was no longer needed to fight for. It discussed these disparities between the communities and the way that people almost wanted to forget about Polari, because it discussed how the gay man was moving away from being openly effeminate and wanting to appear more masculine. It talked about San Francisco and the ways that the fashions of San Francisco and the ways that gay men were adopting this more masculine attire influenced the gay community in the UK, and how this lent to people avoiding using Polari in case it did seem too effeminate, and how nowadays there is this want to learn more about it because of the history there and the recognition that the fight is far from over because of the way in which the world works, and to perhaps avoid complacency. Paul Baker is writing with an exceptional style here, and in a way that makes this topic feel accessible, but it almost felt like a thriller in the reading of it because it is written with such verve. It comes from a place of love of language and also of great knowledge about a history and a topic, and I was particularly enthralled by it. The next book that I read was Fairyland by Alysia Abbott. This book came recommended by Sarah over at Hardcover Hearts. This book is a memoir told by the author and says a memoir of my father. Alysia Abbott is a woman who was brought up by a gay father in the 1970s after the death of her mother, and explores the way that he raised her, the community at the time, and the AIDS epidemic through the 80s and early 90s. This book does not shy away from the more difficult topics when discussing parenting and the ways in which we do not understand our parents, perhaps some of the ways that Steve Abbott didn't understand his daughter Alysia, and the emotional turmoil that they were both dealing with, both of them having to go through loads of different things within life, perhaps not necessarily knowing how to deal with their grief, where they were in their lives, who they were as people, her father not wishing to hold her back in any way, but she's seeking some sort of parenting role within her life. This memoir is written in a way that all memoirs ought to be written, because the author is using narrative techniques in order to create a fully realised, crafted story. Sometimes when you have memoir or you have any form of biography, you will have a writer who wants to just almost bullet point their life and get every single thing down on the page. What Alysia Abbott has done here is chosen the key moments throughout her life to create and craft a narrative that explored her relationship with her father, but also explored the world at the time. This book inspired me to go on and buy other pieces of reading material. This book has some beautiful prose in it indeed. When I say beautiful, I know, what does that word mean? Because it means entirely different things to entirely different people. It was vivid and it was descriptive, and I got a very good sense of place and time and population from the way in which Alysia Abbott wrote, without it feeling as though I was being bombarded by facts. It glided along. It didn't feel like I was just trapped inside the prose, walking through treacle, wading through treacle, trying to reach some sort of point. It is told with a poet's eye for language, and has a knowledge of literature, has a knowledge of fiction writing that has helped to craft a memoir that is emotional and doesn't shy away from difficult topics. It isn't looking at the past in a rose-tinted fashion. It's just exploring and telling the reader exactly what went on, but through this narrative of what it meant to have a gay father and grow up in the 1970s in San Francisco, and how this may have influenced her life in certain types of ways, and also what that relationship really was like. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It is one that I will go back to simply for the writing, and I think that it gave an alternative perspective, and I'm also grateful for learning more about the part of the world that I didn't know, more about gay history, and that it inspired me to go and acquire some more books to read on certain topics. So, incredibly grateful of this book's existence. And then I read Still Life by Sarah Winman. I can't talk about this book because I did read it for the BookTube Prize. As I said at the start of this video, I had hoped to read more books from the BookTube Prize this month. All I will say is that at one point this book mentions a song that didn't come out until a year after the scene in which that chapter is set. And that's all I'll say about that. So, then's the books. There weren't too many books this month, but I did pull out a few new favourites, and I am grateful for that, as always. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.